Gammadda. For the people, by the people.
Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
Hello there, good evening and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. This evening my guest is Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu from the CPA, the Centre for Policy Alternatives. Now then, the question really that we want to pose Dr. Saravanamuttu is whether the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution addresses the citizens' concerns. We're asking this in a sort of ambience of various arrests being made. Some people call it a witch hunt and so on and so forth, especially a witch hunt against the people who were peaceful protesters. Let's ask Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu. Very good evening, Doctor, and welcome to Newsline Live. Does the 22nd Amendment sort out the citizens' concerns?
No, it very clearly does not. It does not go to the heart of their concerns at all. Look, I mean, what was the Aragalair all about at the end of the day? The Aragalair at the end of the day brought to a crescendo the public's dissatisfaction, frustration with the mode of governance in this country and the corruption and the ineptitude with which it had been done. And so when you think about this amendment, does it go to the heart of dealing with the question of the powers of the executive president? Does it really restrict the powers of the executive president? And indeed, was the Aragalair about restricting the powers of the executive president or abolishing them in its entirety? Now, what this amendment does is that it skirts around the surface. It doesn't get to the heart of the matter, which is about the checks and balances on the power of the executive. And as far as I'm concerned, the single most responsible, I mean, an absolute obstacle to any kind of governance in this country has been the executive presidency, and we should get rid of it. That is what the Aragalair wants. That is what the voice of the people wanted and still want, and that's what we should get. We are just, you know, skirting around the surface, or the edges, as it were, in order to satisfy the sort of thing of saying, look, yes, we did something with regard to governance. But what's the point? It's just a gesture? It's an empty gesture at the most, because it doesn't go to the heart of the matter, and the heart of the matter is the power of the executive president.
That is the problem.
That is the problem.
Has it always been the problem, or has it sort of grown?
Well, I think it has always been the problem, because if you have a structure of power with this office at the center of it, everything emanates from it, you know. And so, if you do not balance and check through Parliament and through other institutions in the country the exercise of that power by this apex, at the apex you have this presidency, if you don't, you know, challenge that, then you have a very authoritarian government. It facilitates authoritarianism because it concentrates and consolidates power in this single office.
And yet, with all that, we had one president who sort of ran off.
Well, yes, and he ran off because he was in effect chased off, because the people in this country took matters into their own hands and directly asserted their sovereignty in tens of thousands. And therefore he couldn't stay in office. He fled. Now, this is not the way that we should be changing presidents. We should be having proper constitutional processes. But those constitutional processes should answer to the needs of the people.
And Dr. Saravanamuttu, now then, the president fled. And I noticed that the organization which represent the CPA have gone to the Supreme Court about the emergency regulations. Why and what precisely is bothering you about that?
Well, I mean, you know, we have used emergency in this country so easily, and it has been allowed to happen. Executive convenience has overruled everything. The issue about an emergency is that it should be exceptional and unique circumstances of crisis Do we have that in the country? In the sense of, is there a particular threat to our security? We all know that apart from the isolated incidents, and they were not done by the people in the Aragalaya, they were probably done by people from outside, the Aragalaya was largely, predominantly peaceful. It also presented a picture of Sri Lanka, of what Sri Lanka should be, in that it was not sexist, it was not ageist, it didn't discriminate according to sexual preference, it did not discriminate according to race, ethnicity, religion, all of that kind of thing. And so, you know, why bring an emergency when people are voicing their protests against misgovernance in their own country? They are demonstrating their fundamental rights in the most obvious and direct way. The powers of those emergencies were, to use the legal term, they were overbroad. They provided the executive with the power and authority to do any number of things, you know, which is ridiculous. I mean, for example, there were the laws with regard to sexual orientation that hold the sodomy laws. Those were brought in as well, I understand, and then were taken out subsequently. But, you know, the blanket resort to the use of emergency, to the 22nd Amendment, which doesn't go to the heart of the matter, all suggests that the government is, yes, wanting to establish law and order according to its perception, but in effect what we're talking about is control.
So we had the president, but at the time he was sort of the prime minister this time round, who said that the Aragalaya, the protesters can go on. Let them be there, he said. And yet, no sooner has he become the president, we saw a sort of action overnight to sort of clear this. And then there's also this announcement that we will give you these other spaces that you can go. So what's the nuance there then?
Well, if you look at it from the government's point of view, I think the argument here is this, is look, yes, this was popular discontent, anger, frustration which spilt out into the streets. And there is a good Aragalaya and there is the Kerala, or the bad Aragalaya. There are those who were demonstrating and demonstrating their fundamental rights and all of that, and the bad Aragalaya were the ones who are supposed to want to capture power.
Right.
Yeah, and that distinction therefore ought to be maintained as far as the government is concerned. That is their take on it. Now, the idea of clearing a space and providing a space somewhere where people can go, I mean, I think that's really quite absurd. It's not the answer to the population of the country getting so fed up of the way that they're governed, coming out and demonstrating, and then told to go and do it in some sort of backwater, or, you know, where no one will see them, where they will not attract attention or anything like that, that defeats the whole purpose. So at one level, when you look at it, the government would sort of say, look, you know, we are not saying shut down the Aragalaya or all of that. We are saying, yes, it was a good thing and all of that. However, there were elements that infiltrated, there were elements that used violence, there were elements that wanted to take over the state, there were elements that engaged in criminal activity, and the law of the land must be brought to bear upon them, and that we will not desist from. You know, so I suppose that is the argument, that they're saying that there were criminal elements or terrorists, because there have been people who've been taken in under the Prevention of Terrorism Act as well, who are suspected therefore of being terrorists. You know, so I think that is just ridiculous. It is authoritarian, it is ridiculous, it puts the government into very, very bad order, and, you know, at a time at which the economic situation demands that we come together united as a country and face these challenges, and we are told the challenges are going to get a lot worse. You know, you don't divide the population by doing this.
Well, the debt, the overall debt position Sri Lanka, depending on which exchange rate you use, can be anything between 17 trillion with a T or even 35 trillion. Part of this 17 trillion, the foreign exchange was done at 202.
Yeah.
Today it's 360 plus. So you have that. And surely, Dr. Saravanamuttu, isn't the economic crisis and the lack of dollars and so on, isn't that the most important matter right now?
Well, it is the most important matter right now, but it's a question of how do you deal with it. If there is going to be further hardship and sacrifice that has to be borne by, having to deal with it, then you have to have all the people behind you. The government has to get its legitimacy from the people. And as we've always said, this is a crisis of governance. Yes, the economic dimension is the most pressing, but there are serious political questions too that have to be resolved. And so by ignoring one and focusing entirely on the other, you're not going to solve the problem. You have to deal with the two together. And certainly dealing with the two together is about bringing people together, carrying on that conversation with the public so that they provide you the legitimacy that you require in order to resolve the problem. People need a government at the end of the day who they can trust and who they have confidence in.
Now, I wonder if, I had this conversation in the last hour with a foreigner who was telling another Sri Lankan that, from his perspective, he said, I see that the people are fearful. He said some weeks ago people were not so frightened. They spoke out and shouted out and so on. He said, now I get the feeling, he says, that the people here in Sri Lanka are fearful. Do you think that there is this fear psychosis which is triggered off by these sort of mass arrests of protesters and so on?
Well, I think it is that those people who were actively engaged in the Aragalaya and came into the limelight as a consequence of that as being the leaders of the Aragalaya, who have been arrested and questioned and all of that, their associates, etc., must be living with a certain amount of fear, not knowing, are they going to be taken in for questioning, are they going to be taken in terms of being arrested and charged, put under PTA, whatever. So there is that lot of people. I think there is another lot of people who are concerned about having enough fuel, electricity, all of that to make ends meet on a daily basis. There are those people who are concerned about the serious lack and shortage with regard to drugs, the whole question of access to food, feeding their children, milk powder, saline, all of those questions, So they may be not so involved or interested in the demands of the Aragalaya in terms of the political demands and the economic demands such as there were, but they want this to be resolved so that they can have their 3 square meals a day, So they may not be so much in living in fear, whereas the other people, yes, I think that is probably right.
And thank you very much for your questions by SMS or WhatsApp 0772 300 305. Dr. Saravanamuttu, one of our viewers is asking whether, in your view, whether the foreign policy of this current administration is beneficial in solving the crisis in the country, and if not, where have they gone wrong?
Well, I think, if you take the recent foreign policy crisis, which involved the Chinese ship, I think the government has dealt with it fairly deftly, insofar as the objections raised by the Indians and indeed by the Americans, they have been met. The Indians are giving us the 2 planes. We've got one already. The warship came and it will be leaving on the 22nd, and the issue is resolved in that respect. So we managed to counterbalance whatever message that China was trying to make with the Indian offer of those 2 ships. But we can't lurch from crisis to crisis in this respect. We need to move towards a rule-based system of competition, because there will be competition between the Chinese and the Indians and the Americans in this area, to provide a certain stability within the Indian Ocean region. So that whole idea that we should revert back to non-alignment, I think, is an excellent idea. That is what we should be doing. And we should be pointing out to both the Indians and the Chinese that, look, our relationships are not zero-sum. It's not a question of we are with India and against China, or we are with China and against India. We're with both of you. Because as a country, we've had long-standing relationships with both of you, and at the present moment we need you, and need you badly.
On that note, let's take a quick break and take a peek at this evening's headlines from the News First Primetime News team. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
3 IUSF activists charged under PTA and detained under detention orders. Multiple groups condemn using PTA against dissent.
දැන් සන්නද්ධ ව්‍යාපාරවලට මූණ දෙන අනපනත් වලින් නීති රීති වලින් තමයි පාට බහින මිනිස්සුන්ට මූණ දෙන්නේ.
අපි ආණ්ඩුවට තදින් අවධානය කළා කියනවා මෙවැනි මරණකාරීත්වයන් වහම නතර කරන්න.
Fuel procurement made a profit-making venture, a revelation from Champika Ranawaka. Bribery Commission discontinues investigation on bribes to cross over. Is the board tour ready to take up ministerial positions?
සාකච්ඡා කරගෙන යනවා මොනවා කරන්නත් ආණ්ඩුවක් තියෙනවනේ සුදුසු අයට සුදුසු දේවල් ලැබෙයි අපි.
Opposition leader ready to meet president again to discuss plans to build the country.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation with Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu from the Centre for Policy Alternatives. Question from one of our viewers to you. If GR comes back, would it be possible to arrest him, Cabral, PB, etc., for having brought the country down to its knees? Whilst they're chasing the Aragalaya kids for misdemeanors, isn't the need of the hour to put things right by charging the people who are responsible for the state the country is in?
Absolutely, but there has to be due process. So there has to be a charge, there has to be evidence to back up that charge, and yes, and the due process of the law can take over. But without that, with the moment he lands, sort of sending police to arrest him or something like that,
That'd be rather dramatic.
it would be very dramatic, and I think also unsound and unfair.
Do you think, bearing in mind that 134 people in Parliament voted for Mr. Wickremesinghe, what chances are there that one of the sort of mainstays of that party will get arrested on arrival?
Sorry, one of the mainstays of which party?
SLPP.
SLPP. Well, no. I mean, the point I think is this, is that I'm sure Mr. Wickremesinghe will come to the conclusion that, look, if there is a charge and due process can be applied, then, of course, it can go ahead. But in the absence of that, I don't think Mr. Wickremesinghe is going to order that former President Rajapaksa be arrested on sight when he lands in Colombo. That's absurd.
Right. Although these the youth of the Aragalaya are being hunted down for, as one of our viewers says, for misdemeanors.
No, so I mean, this is the point. No, in Sri Lanka, we have not had equality before the law. We have not had the rule of law. The law has been applied in a variety of ways, depending on who it is being applied to. And as a consequence of the Aragalaya, as a consequence of the opportunity that we now have to redesign a new social contract for our country, we must make sure that we firmly entrench the rule of law and principles like the equality of before the law in the system of law and order, the judicial system, in the public affairs of our country.
There's another view who says that isn't it ironic that what we might have expected from President Gotabaya Rajapaksa in terms of this sort of high-handed clearing of spaces and arresting people was actually not done by him, but by another person who was sort of sympathetic initially and whose wife also attended Dargale. That's the question, that they didn't expect this kind of action from Wickremesinghe, but they did expect it from Gotabaya, but Gotabaya didn't do it.
Well, I don't know who you're referring to, but they obviously have not been very good judges of character at the end of the day, because it so appears to be the case that most people who thought that Gotabaya Rajapaksa would come down very forcibly on the Aragale, etc., were proved incorrect, and that he turned out, now some people accuse him of being a coward, that he was inept, and he was a coward.
It would be polite to say that some people say that he was out of his depth.
Well, he was inept because he was out of his depth, yes.
They also point out the fact that he left Sri Lanka all those years after leaving the army, and they point out that too as being a sort of a test of his not so great character then.
Well, I don't know.
But what do you think the president should be doing now, really, apart from arresting these young people?
Well, no, I mean, what the president should be doing right now, and I think what he is doing at one level, is that he's focusing on the yet-to-be resolved issues of the staff agreement with the IMF, the agreements with our bilaterals, the bridging finance, and the immediate problems with regard to, all right, the fuel crisis and the gas question has been brought under control to a certain extent, but we have problems with regard to fertilizer, with regard to saline, so medicines, the food situation. Those are the things that have to be, that demand the immediate attention of the government and have to be dealt with. Now, as I said before, this is an opportunity to reimagine, redesign the social contract that we are in. And in order to do that, I think we have to come up with very clear political and constitutional reforms. Now, yes, the president is somewhat hobbled by the fact that he has to deal with an SLPP majority, and these reforms may well require a two-thirds majority, etc. But I would like to see a timetable being given to us in terms of when the next elections are going to be, or is this the case that this government is going to last until the constitutional date for the next general election in 2025 or whatever, the next presidential election in 2024. And I would also like to see the government come out and talk about a plan with regard to when the executive presidency will be abolished, you know, because, you know, as far as the economic questions are concerned, yes, they've all been identified. We know what needs to be done. There seems to be a consensus. Even opposition parties are talking about supporting the government as far as the economy is concerned. It's the political questions where there is an issue, and those have also got to be dealt with because they're not going away. And indeed, they should not be allowed to go away.
Indeed. But isn't it better? I was going to ask you about the opposition support for the government. Isn't it better to leave the political questions parked in a sort of short-term parking bay and get to grips with the economy, because surely that is causing the people so much of distress?
Well, I believe the government also, that the government believes that, yes, we can park it there. And we can just do X and Y, you know, tinker at the edges, and the people will be happy with it. But the question is that really going to be the case? Because when things get worse...
And they will, with the food shortage coming up?
Well, exactly. Then all of these things will come back. And if you haven't addressed it, And if you have been seen to be sort of trying to cover it up by sleight of hand or whatever it is, then it's going to rebound to your disadvantage.
There's a viewer who's saying that you, Dr. Saravanamuttu, is a very balanced and educated person and speaks rather well. Shouldn't you be in Parliament invoking the true intent and essence of the national list?
Well, thank you very much to the gentleman or lady for those compliments. Sure.
Have you ever made a pitch?
Pitch? No, I haven't made any pitch.
Would you make a pitch?
To whom?
To the president. Say, look, I can make a difference. I would like to sit there and help you guys draft all these things together instead of fighting and arresting these young people who were protesting and shouting their guts out.
I think that is for party leaders to decide as to who they want to be in Parliament on their ticket, etc. So I'll leave it up to them. I will continue to do what I have always done, and hopefully it will make a difference to the lives of people.
Would you say that you've been a bit of a pain in the sides of these various politicians and their parties?
Well, I suppose yes, given their reaction to me as well.
Right.
Yeah.
But you have no intention of stopping what you're doing?
No, absolutely none.
Because you are acting pro the people?
Well, I believe so.
And we've got a few more minutes here. These questions are mostly all the same. But there's a lot of questions about arresting the people responsible for the state of affairs in the country. Is that easier said than done?
Well, in order to be able to do that, I suppose the state must feel secure. And what we have, as we all know, is a president who doesn't have support of his own in Parliament. Yeah? And we're talking about those parliamentarians giving him support to arrest their leaders. You know, so unless they sort of go through the sort of Pauline conversion and sort of ditch their leaders and sort of say, look, we're going with someone else, and yes, it is time for us to clean up everything, or else we won't be back, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it. So that is why the argument is for a general election.
If Mr. Wickremesinghe is if it's true about all his connections in the West and so on, why would it be that it's only France who's just lifted their travel advisory, but our big market, the United Kingdom, which is also a huge trading partner with us, why isn't Mr. Wickremesinghe been unable to get the British to lift their travel advisory?
I honestly don't know what the answer to that, but I fully expect that since France has lifted the travel advisory in terms of telling people, allowing people or saying that it's safe to come to Sri Lanka, that many other countries will follow, if not immediately, fairly soon.
So in your view, Dr. Saravanamuttu, we need a political solution first, immediately?
We need the two to work in tandem. We need the two to work in tandem. There are political reforms that have to take place if the economic reforms are going to be accepted and implemented as they are intended to be implemented. So you can't really separate out and say this is politics and this is economics, then we'll do this first and then come back. It's political economy at the end of the day. And that's what the two components make up what I would call the governance question in Sri Lanka.
And here's another question, also from a member of the public. Dr. Saravanamuttu and the CPA, do you all view the judiciary in Sri Lanka as being independent enough, or does it need some tweaking?
Well, I would say this. The judiciary in Sri Lanka can always be more independent, and I think that holds for any country. You know, I think that, you know, there was a time when the judiciary was rather executive friendly. And I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. And that is to be entirely welcomed and encouraged.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu from the Centre for Policy Alternatives. We've much enjoyed your presence here, as we always do.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's the way it was on Newsline Live tonight. Take care. Have a great evening ahead of you, and even a good weekend as you possibly can. Take care.
Yes,
and
Friday.
as always, God bless you all.
It is Friday.
It is.